Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to say a special thanks to our producers, Jason Stark and Taylor Turzek. They put in so much work behind the scenes, and we appreciate them. And also to Alan Files, who puts in a lot of work behind the scenes, especially when things go wrong with the website, but also maintenance of the website as well, as James Steinbach, who helps out there as well. So thanks to both of them. If you get the chance to share the word about OnScript, please do so on whatever platform you can do that. That really helps us. Otherwise, enjoy the episode. And if you'd like to donate to OnScript, you can do so at onscript.study/donate. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome back to another episode of OnScript. Today, we're going to be chatting once again with Marty Folsom. We had you on about 2 years ago, I think it was.
That's about right.
Yeah, I think so, wasn't it? To talk about, well, Volume 1 of your Church Dogmatics for Everyone. And this is Volume 2. You're looking at Church Dogmatics Volume 2. So it made sense to continue our discussion. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say today. But first, I think I should probably introduce you again for those who are fortunate enough to have a listen to the first episode. Though, do tune in. Do have a look for that one on the webpage. I'll put a link in the episode information for sure. But Marty is Professor of Theology and Biblical Studies and has been for 32 years in New Zealand and Seattle, and now lives on the beautiful Camino Island. Have I pronounced that correctly?
That is correct.
And he's also been a therapist for 26 years. Well, it's more than that now. It's getting on to 30 years, as well as the author of the Face-to-Face trilogy on relational theology, which, you know, key to your entire project there is the language of personal relationship. And apart from authoring numerous articles, you are the author of the Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics for Everyone series. 2 have now been published. The third is close to being published, I think, isn't it?
It is in at Zondervan. It's, we're working on the final edits before publication. It takes them a while to get it out. Should be out for the Karl Barth conference next year, is what they've told me. So it takes literally 2 years from when I handed it in to get that done. And of course, it was twice the length for CD3 as it was for the other one. So, and I'm working through 4.2 at this point. So we're cruising right along.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to look at the second volume today, and I said this in the first episode with you, and it is something I truly mean. You're the kind of theologian and person I aspire to be. As I've said before, your gentleness is evident to everyone that you encounter, and if any of you do go to SBL, AAR, do make a beeline for Marty if he is present. It's a pleasure to have you on OnScript again today.
It's a pleasure to be here. I can only tell you, I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Well, I've got some questions, really, to begin with. Let's just do bigger picture. The big picture. Why this series?
So, it's part of a long journey of basically asking the question, how do we allow the God who wants to speak to do exactly that? And so much theology talks about God. And the nature of Karl Barth's work is that he really believes that God speaks, God spoke, God speak, God will continue to speak. And so that in the person of Christ, we come to know this living God. And so in the years of my studying Karl Barth, just to recognize the different trajectory and the opening of the voice of God, the nature of our becoming recipients of hearing who God is, but also who we are in the light of that, just opens up really the treasure of what relationships look like, the knowing and being known. And the Church Dogmatics are specifically focused on that. So this is not only a great theological work, it's a great call to restoration as God sees it, that we are made for relationship, and that Jesus is the one who comes and says, I am for you and I am with you every single day. And so this series is really an investigation of how that becomes not something to think about, but becomes the lived experience of our lives.
Beautiful. Well, Marty, one of the things that struck me when I first delved into these volumes is just how well they were structured. What you were trying to do was quite unique. There's clearly a lot of pedagogical wisdom in these pages. Could you just walk us through how you've structured this book, what you're hoping to achieve from all of the very discrete sections?
Yeah, and there are many layers of structure within it, but to say in the big picture, there are three kind of main sections. And in this second book, the opening chapters, 6 chapters, where the first book really took you into the landscape of how do you enter into the landscape of the discovery of God. In this one, we enter into the soundscape of the being of God. So what does it mean to truly become listeners to God saying, okay, you want to know who I am? Here's who I am, and here are the ways that people get confused. So there are chapters just to begin at a very broad spectrum and to take you into where you are ready to really hear what it is that God is going to reveal in this book, which this volume is the Doctrine of God. And it would be so easy to think it's a bunch of words we throw up at God instead of going, nope, this is God at the mic. This, here I am. Here's who I am for you. So that is what the first section. Then the chapters that follow each take one of the paragraphs of the Church Dogmatic, which again, those are quite long often. But following this theme of music throughout the book, I attempt to, in each paragraph, to give a simple introduction, to then go through and just condense down, sometimes taking a page or two down to a sentence, and to have them just be a sentences as clear as possible with no technical language, so that you really get a sense that you're entering into the meaning that Barth was hoping to get across. And to then also give insights for pastors, for theologians, because often people survey this material and even survey arguments. But the question, so what is a pastor or a theologian who's getting going supposed to get out of this? So it's the kind of tour guide approach that I talk about of really saying, when you get to this city, make sure you see this.
Yeah.
And make sure you hear this about the history of it. So that is all very important for the book. And then in the end, I have 8 essays that are attempting to really take that subtitle, A Step-by-Step Guide for Beginners in Prose, Church Dogmatics for Everyone. Well, the prose part is to have 8 essays by significant people in their fields talking about how this particular volume relates to their field. And so I have an amazing starting person in there, this guy named Chris Tilling, who's doing CD2 and biblical studies.
Oh, yeah. I've heard a lot about him.
You've heard of him before. Yeah. He's amazing. So to then say this book and each of the volumes is not intended to be just a dive into theology. It's a view that theology really is supposed to be speaking into major areas of our life, and that the people who live in those areas could just give us a glimpse that gets us going to continue a conversation so that it truly does become for everyone. Because I think Barth intended that to be the scope of what he was doing. So that is an extended conversation then to say that the nature of theology, the nature of who Jesus is not just for the church or the theologians, but that it really is to speak to the arts, to science, to mental health, that all these things really do better when they pay attention to what it is that Barth is saying.
And in addition to this overarching structure as a whole, in individual sections, you've got focus statements, introductions, context. You're really highlighting these are insights for pastors, these are insights for theologians, and so on. It makes it very reader friendly. And just to back up as well, of course, I'm sure many who are tuning into this will be broadly aware of the Church Dogmatics and how it is structured, but very much, as you say, you're going right through each and every single paragraph of volume 2 from 25 right through to 39. There's nothing is skipped.
No.
Now, what was a highlight for you then in this particular volume? What was a personal highlight for you, do you think?
I think it was a little bit surprising to go through when asking about the nature of the metaphor, to hear music as a way of listening to Barth. Of course, Barth began every morning putting Mozart on, and there was something about really allowing the grandeur of God through the wonder of Mozart, the brilliance that he, in a sense, saw that was opened up for him, that it wasn't all about him. And so to recognize that for Barth, there is this opening up to the grandeur of the person revealed to the person of Jesus, and to say there's something about the nature of music that really opens up what we mean by harmony and resonance and dissonance and all these things, that I just saw that so much of what Barth was doing is really attuning us to the hearing of the person of Jesus, and through him to the Father, by the Spirit who gives us these ears to hear and to enter into the harmony ourselves, that we are not really passive, but we are active, involved in what it is that's going on. So to be able to take major kinds of things and reduce them, my simple little CD tune in a chorus: ask not whether God is known, in the word my love is shown, choosing freely from above, my gift for you, those made for love. That encapsulates the whole of the dogmatics in 4 sentences that become the chorus of a song. I haven't put it to music yet, but to just stop and say, if we really allow the simplicity and beauty to be musical in a sense, and to have this speaking of God, we have so many songs about God in worship, but what if we allow what Barth's doing in the Doctrine of God to let Jesus speak and invite us into what it is that he's revealing? This became the delight for me, is just discovering, in a sense, in the process, how what it is that Barth is doing is so well played out and invitational for me, and then hopefully for other readers, to enter into something that doesn't feel like going and sitting in a building and listening to somebody lecture, but it's more like being at a grand reunion with people who have all kinds of musical instruments and voices and styles of music, and saying, let's all listen to what it is that the one who brings us here invites us to do and to be, as together we make a music that follows his lead.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, I must say, our mutual friend Jeremy Begbie has probably taught us both a good deal about the importance of musical metaphors, and certainly in Paul, I've got to say, there is a lot of scope for thinking about these things long and hard. And it really, the whole project, hasn't it, has made much of musical metaphors. Could you give us any other insights in particularly how this metaphor will help readers engage with Barth?
Yeah, so if we imagine a world without music, a musicless world is kind of an emotionless world. And we end up with kind of rational arguments and all that. The nature of music is that it does resonate in a space and invites it, as Jeremy says, it awakens other things that, if you hit on a piano or something, it's awakening other things in the piano just by the striking of one key. So the nature of looking at a theme like the God who loves in freedom, well, what does that mean? Well, God has perfections. If you start thinking of those as the octaves of God, and you start thinking of the resonance of different aspects of that playing together, things that you would have separated out suddenly come together, and you start to see the interplay of these things, and they start to touch on our emotions. And emotions isn't just feelings in our head. It's, I really think that emotions are the nature of our relationship. So if you don't feel loved by God, then not feeling loved by God means you have a bad theology. If you're afraid of God, as Adam and Eve were and hid, they started the first bad theology. God's going to get you, and you better hide. Music is the invitation to come out and say, yeah, there may be a place for lament. There may be a place for celebration. It's all within the life that is there. So to be able to recognize how music ignites us, and that music at some level is what some people like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, their creation themes really begin with music. For Tolkien in the Silmarillion, creation begins with the singing into being of creation. And for Lewis and the Magician's Nephew, Aslan sings creation into being. And there's something about those creative writers, too, that just said there is something about the nature of the personal dimension of singing, the creative capacity that comes from it, and the invitational awakening of a whole world that flows from it, that I just found to be very true to the nature of what God wants to do in the Doctrine of God. So if we also imagine a world without words, I mean, music, I kind of grew up as a singer. I was in choir and sing choir. The first class I ever took in college was music theory with the intent of being a vocal music instructor in high school. I hated theory because it didn't sing. And so I really wanted this book to not be theory. I wanted it to sing and to allow the invitational sense that I experienced as a vocalist to come into being. And so to say in this book, finding language that is not theoretical, but is invitational in the way that music can be, allows for the dimension of what a song like Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. I mean, there it is right there. That saved a wretch like me. And at the end, we've no less days to sing God's praise. There's something about the nature of the singingness of theology that allows it to transcend the mere rational stuck in the head or stuck on the page, and allows us to live in this interplay of hearing the whisper of the Spirit. Do you know the Father's love for you? Do you know the nature of the perfection of the love and freedom that He has for you? And to call out a response for us that I think is what Barth really wants to get at. So music just worked everywhere and really opened up things that I hadn't seen before in the bringing things into a kind of listening place to what might be there that I hadn't seen.
Lovely. I remember actually chatting with Lincoln Harvey on this podcast about his book, Jesus in the Trinity. And he was looking closely at the theology of Robert Jensen. And he came to some very, very similar conclusions about the importance of musical metaphors, both in his own constructive theology and in looking at Robert Jensen, who, of course, as we know, was Barthian. Is that can we use that as a word these days? I don't know.
We can for the purpose of this, we can do that. So
for this one, fair enough.
And to say all language is metaphorical, everything's pointing, right? And so music just adds the dimension so that instead of having, what would a world without music and a world without words look like?
Yeah.
We would just kind of nod at one another or something, but we'd miss all of the richness of relationship. And I think that's really what came for me, is the richness of relationship that becomes possible in musical metaphors.
Well, if there are any musicians out there listening to this who could help Marty out in maybe turning some of this into music, I might end up just throwing it the direction of Suno, the AI program, just to see what I can come up with, but just for my own personal amusement. Now, what are the key elements of the Doctrine of God as presented in Church Dogmatics Volume 2? What does Barth do that others don't? I mean, these are still big picture questions I'm asking you, but could you touch on this slightly open-ended and completely unfair question?
It's not completely unfair. It's quite exciting to think about, isn't it? To say that the first book really sat you down like we did here and said, okay, there's your mic, there's your headphones, there's your computer. Now you know how to listen, how to speak and interact. That's really what Volume 1 wants to do. The word, and all that. So in Volume 2, we really have Barth saying, okay, now God's going to talk. And we're also going to recognize there's a lot of talk that people do that isn't what he's saying. So we really want to clarify, what is it that God says? What is it he's saying? And what is he not saying? And where does it take us if we go there? So to say that, God's revelation really opens up in this. The nature of the God who loves in freedom is really the main theme, I would say, of CD2:1. And in saying what it is that God wants to be known as is the one who loves in freedom, with all of the variations within that. And variations are perfections is the word. Perfections in some people's mind would put God beyond. But if love is perfected in all the ways that it needs to meet us, the perfections of God are Barth showing us all the ways that God speaks in love. The most difficult for some, particularly being the word wrath, and is like, how can the God who lives in freedom have wrath? Which I love Fleming Rutledge's image in a book she wrote on Tolkien, and saying, the ring wraiths are twisted beings that had once been humans but became twisted. Wreaths are twisted grapevines or whatever they're brought together. The nature of God's wrath is the untwisting of our being. So that where God sees that we are twisting the nature of our human existence, God's wrath is the coming and saying no to this, no to that violence, no to that way of not loving one another, no to the things that you say about me. So wrath is the corrective love of God. And so to just see that as one of the perfections of how the God who loves in freedom is worked out is just an example of this main theme, particularly of 2:1. And then the flip side of that is his conversation around natural theology, which I call how not to do a sleight of hand and say you're talking about God, then throw your own stuff in, or how not to be prejudicial, because prejudice is coming in with your own categories of what's acceptable and then trying to fit God and others within it. Natural theology is doing that, reading in from our own sensibility of what must be the case, and then seeing how God fits into it. And so Barth's going, nope, none of that prejudice stuff. So where people think Barth is standing against nature and appreciating and loving nature, he loved the Swiss Alps. He loved nature. He just hated people abusing God and one another based on their categories of prejudice. And so to really get clear on what is happening there in 2:1 is to recognize the clarifying work of really letting who God is show up is hugely significant. When you get to CD2 then, the election, which often we so much make election to be about who's in and who's out, who made the team and who didn't. But to see that the nature of Jesus being the one who God has chosen to be for us and with us in all time, it's not just about whether you go to heaven or hell. It's really God electing to always be the one who is with us and for us. And that the nature of when you get that he's always with us, you act differently, i.e. as one who is loved. That's what ethics is. And so the final section of it, of the second volume, is going to be the way that we understand who God is as the one who's present, which informs then the nature of how we act as those who are loved. And I just think of the song the Beatles made famous in 1963, Till There Was You. There was love all around, but I never heard it singing. No, I never heard it all till there was you. That's CD2. That's election. I hadn't seen it, but then you were there. And it goes on to say, and then there was music and wonderful roses, they tell me, and sweet fragrant meadows of dawn and dew. This opening up, and that's, I mean, there's a meadow image there, but I just think of the nature of the music. And the first line is, then there was music.
Yeah.
And so I think this just captures the sense of the flow of Barth opening up. Let's get God right. Let's see that God is for us and with us. And then let's begin to see who God is. It's not what do we do? It's who God is. It's the one who is going to become the one whose love awakens us to all that we might be because of who he is.
Yeah. Just a little prophecy here. I think I'm going to be bold enough. What you said about wrath there at the beginning, or how do you say it, Anna?
Yes.
Wrath? Sorry, wrath? Is that the American way? How do you say...
Wrath.
Let's just stick with wrath. I'll get confused otherwise.
Wrath, either one works.
Yeah.
You say potato, and I say potato.
That I predict that in the next 10 years, there's going to be a few texts, books published on the meaning of wrath in the New Testament, and particularly Paul, where some of these notions are mobilized, because I think many of us have projected certain expectations onto that kind of language, and it needs to be evangelized by the gospel. And I think we see some of that, when we deal with root metaphors and so on in Paul, we're going to see these two worlds coming together. Anyway, it's just a bit of an aside, but I suspect that there's some work to be done on that in the world of biblical studies as well.
One other thing on that, just to say, the yes of God is really, volume 2:1, the yes of God, is to say the gospel is always the yes of God first, the loves. We often give gospel presentation, we are sinners, which it invites the no of God as a starting point that looks like wrath is what precedes everything, right?
Yeah.
So you get wrath out of context, you're going to mess it all up.
That's right.
But if you unpack it the way that Barth does, preceding that the yes of God will include saying no to those things which are not loving, then you see it in context. But you can say to any person, anywhere, God's love for you is infinite, unstoppable, And there will be things in your life that will be said no to, but it's only for the sake that love will be known, experienced for you, with you, through you, and for others. That the gospel itself is the good news, that even wrath is part of the God bringing into attunement our lives into the grand and glorious music of God.
Yeah, lovely. And folks, this is why it matters when it comes to readers of Paul, because it's certain readings of Romans that tend to energize and stimulate and justify the account that is the opposite of the one Marty is talking about, the one that begins with wrath and therefore conditions all of our God talk prior to and independent of Jesus Christ, and much more besides. But Marty, can I come back to the question of freedom? As you know, as you've just said, that the God who loves in freedom is, it's like the major title over the whole here. And Barth is really intentional at explaining the relationship between revelation and freedom, and God and freedom. But certainly, I think in, can I say Western Christianity? Probably more than that, but certainly in Western Christianity, certain notions of freedom tend to get assumed. And I do wonder sometimes if someone's coming fresh, green behind the ears, coming to Barth and reading all this business about freedom, they might be predisposed to misunderstand certain things. It's freedom of choice. It's whether I do A or B. It's a zero-sum relationship to God's actions and all of that. Do you think you could just tell us a little bit more about Barth's understanding of freedom and how that might correct some of our own intuitions?
Yeah. I think in the West, and particularly in the United States, today's the 4th of July here, and so it's a celebration of independence and freedom from, right? So the nature of freedom largely is leave me alone, and for many people, freedom is nobody can tell me what to do, a license to sin in a sense, which Paul, of course, deals with that as well. So if we see that our ways of being formatted in freedom is kind of a loss of anybody or a resistance to anybody controlling us, if we then come and look at the nature of the freedom God, it is the freedom that comes from being with. Now, I know you've got a beautiful wife and some amazing kids, and somehow I believe that when they are with you, they feel a freedom to be who they are, knowing your love for them, and you actually know more of who you are because of who they are. The delight of coming home to see them, to go on a trip with them, and to see them experiencing the world. So to say freedom is this way that unfolds as we're with those who live from love and for love with one another. And so to say the nature even of election, which we kind of make it about a choice, as though, God's got to make a decision about this, instead of God has decided to be free to be himself always as the one who loves. And he's not going to let his love get in the way of human freedom. That's actually going to be the context and the grounding for humans to actually be free, to experience what it means to be beloved ones, to recognize the joy and value of being with and for those who are accompanied by God, who is like the one who wants to take you on the grandest tour of life that could ever be. And in his accompaniment, he's saying, and here's this, and here's that, and here I am all the way. I want you to see and to live and to breathe and to love and be loved. And at the end of the day, to be exhausted because you are so filled with love that it's an exhaustion that energizes you. And so freedom, real freedom, I think, isn't just doing our own thing. It's discovering what the outworkings of love might look like. And to recognize that God is limited only by this. I will only be free to always be that one, the one who lives in freedom. I won't be the capricious God, the judgmental God, the, well, we'll see down the road, wait till dad gets home kind of 1950s image. All of that is gone because that wasn't free at all. That was a life lived from fear, and Barth wants to eliminate that as the clarity, the actuality of the person of Jesus shows up and meets with the most unlikely people, stands against the religious people. He was friend of sinners and was saying no to those people who were so self-satisfied with their own judgments that he recognized these people are bound up in the prison of their own mind and they're imprisoning everybody else. We need to allow the Spirit of the Lord to do work here, to set free the captives, to heal the brokenhearted, those who are imprisoned, to see their lives opened up. So I think freedom just is for Barth the nature and character of God, being the God who is loving beyond what we can imagine and is always going to be that. So don't look for test cases of what ifs. Nope, just stick with the, yep, that's what love looks like when it's freely expressed in thought, in word, in deed, in relationship, in community, in a hope for the future.
Lovely. And I think incredibly pregnant words there as well in our own ideological, political landscapes in North America and the UK certainly, but further abroad. Your chat, I'm really keen to get to this one because I've been reading this part of Church Dogmatics to myself recently. In your chapter on the knowledge of God, you discuss the fulfillment, knowability, and limits of knowing God. And, well, can you just briefly elaborate on Barth's view on these aspects and how you managed to present them in a way that was boiled down into far fewer pages?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, it's not necessarily easy because there's a lot packed in here.
Yeah.
But the nature of the fulfillment of God is to say, we live in an individualistic society, so we think of fulfillment as something that fulfills me in and of myself, by myself. What are my favorite foods? What are my favorite activities? What about me? The fulfillment of God is that God claims us as his own. He takes our deaf ears and opens us up to hear him speak to us. And in his speaking to us, he says, I will never be who I am without you. Fulfillment is going to be fulfilled in me as it is in you when we each live in this openness one to the other. And the idea of recognizing, and I think it was Alan Torrance who first said this, did you decide to fall in love one day? Was that a decision you had in the morning? He says, no. Love is when you open up to somebody who comes and you go, wow, I never imagined you. And there is a sense of fulfillment that happens when you recognize that you couldn't plan a life fulfilling yourself like the reality that comes when you find one who is beloved to you, who you find loves you. I love the song, When I Fall in Love, particularly the moment. And the moment that I feel you feel that way too is the moment I fall in love with you. The nature of fulfillment is that discovering of another who sees us, knows us, and loves us, and we can respond then to that knowing and being known. And so Barth in this opening section on fulfillment really is making clear and articulate the nature and clarity of the God who loves and is claiming us not to be his minions, but to be his beloved, right? And in the light of that, to say that we can become fulfilled, because if we're not being loved, then we're probably living in some kind of fear. I'm afraid of not measuring up. I'm afraid of doing it wrong. And that will never bring fulfillment. So the power of love to liberate and create the space within which we are fulfilled is hugely the part of what's opened up. Now, the knowability of God is like an artesian spring of life-giving water, light, all that we would say fulfilled in the person of Jesus. God is just ready to be that source of springing forth life that might come for us as humans in the look of an eye, a smile. There are so many things that when you get that look, there's a sense that this person knows me and sees me, and I can see it in their demeanor, their tone of voice, the tenderness, the kindness, the lovingness. And so God gives himself in the person of Jesus to be that very knowability that God is not hidden. He's not somewhere out there beyond the clouds. He didn't ascend to heaven and get lost up there on a very, very long vacation. But he is the one who still abides with us, in us. He is the one who not only prunes, but harvests and brings us into the delight of what it means to sit at his table, to be those who are both guests, but also who host him. Christ in you and you in Christ, there is a mutuality of knowability. And in that, there then can come depth. And depth is what happens when we have this history of knowing that we are not really somebody who's on somebody's table of contents, but that when they sit down and write, people who have made a difference in my life, that we would say that of Jesus, but he actually says that of us. These are my body. These are my people. This is my family. And so in that knowability also, there is the corrective in this part of natural theology. And so if we only listen to our prior sensibilities, which we often call common sense. I had to laugh once when in Vermont, I saw a sign that said, buckle up your seatbelt, it's common sense. Well, if it was common sense, you wouldn't have to tell people to do that. And the fact of the matter is common sense is probably a myth. It's just kind of the vote of the majority. The communis census, the census of the community is just what most people would vote for. Well, guess what? Most people vote to be for themselves and not for others. They vote to hide themselves so that people won't think badly of them. Our common sensibilities don't open us up to knowing and being known. So Barth's critique of natural theology here is to say, if you're going to get to know God, you've got to let God be the speaker, and you have to be willing to set aside all of those things that you'd like to read onto God. And so even a word like faith, you can't allow your idea of faith be there. You need to let an analogia fidei, an analogy of faith that Jesus comes and is for us and speaks to us. And so we use words that are filled out of their meaning because of who Jesus is. So now love actually means something that it didn't before, because we may have had our parental love or fallen in love with somebody who didn't fall in love with us. And so love is a very ambiguous, fuzzy thing. But when Jesus fills out the meaning of love faithfully, then our faith is just responding and saying, yep, I know that's what you mean when you say you're faithful to me and that you love me. There's a clarity of thought that is the knowability that is there, which creates the analogia, the analogy of relationship. It allows for a relationship to happen. So knowability is not a scientific put into a book in outline form. It's the depth of what happens when you celebrate communion, anniversaries, the birth of a child, the graduation of a child. It's, I know this one, and I'm so delighted to be part of the life of this one. If knowability doesn't have the richness of shared life, it's going to miss what it is that's going on here. And limits then finally, limits are set for clarity. I have this little, I'm always thinking CBD, clarified by distinguishing. And so I mean this, not that. And what I did with wrath, in a sense, was that people think of wrath as God's mad. Instead of God is so loving, he stops that which is not loving, so that love can be worked out. And the nature of being right. The last verse of the book of Judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, that was a human judgment of right. The right of God isn't God just being judgmental like that. It's actually working out us being in right relationship. And so to be setting the limits of the words applied to God and ourselves and to recognize what works there allows us to come to something that is true and not a lie. And to say, really, the greatest dimension of what we call spiritual warfare today is that people lie about God, and they lie about their neighbor, and they lie to themselves about who they are. And when that happens, the limit of God comes and says, I will distinguish that is a lie and this is the truth. And it's a clarifying in the light of who God is as God speaks to us, to be restored in understanding who we are, not from our own tragic stories, but from the story of God that speaks, embraces, brings us to know that we are adopted sons and daughters, and that the nature of what it is that is limited is we have a limited time on earth. We have limits to what we can do. But within that, God is saying, I made you unique and particular and wonderful. Be that. Right? Because I am unique and particular, and I'm going to be that. So in the person of Jesus, I am unique in particular. But guess what? I'm that unique particular way of being for every human being to be who they are as a unique and particular being. So there are limits, but those limits also create openings. And each one of those openings means that there's something that is the fruit of love, being limited to being the loving kind of love that only God can bring, and not living in the swamp of ways that people get caught up in, where when we get off the road, we often get into trouble. And again, this is not a road to limit us from living life. It's actually the road to life. It's the Torah, the way of life. And does it have limits? Yeah, don't hurt others. Yeah, don't hurt yourself. Live knowing that you, every day when you wake up and say, I am a beloved child. And actually hear the Father say, you are my beloved son or daughter. And I'm going to be with you today, every step of the way. Let your thoughts be limited within that which is good and true and lovely and pure, which is my life for you.
Lovely. And I think, these days as well, there's a little bit of a resurgence of interest around the phrase analogia entis, the analogy of being, and the debates around this. And I think probably what you're helping us discover here is the wider theological grammar that is the context for Barth's concerns here, which will be useful even for academic and aspiring theologians to wrestle with. But there's much more to talk about here. We haven't even gotten to election and all of the rest of it, but I did want to have a very brief quick fire round.
Yes.
So you know the rules, just off the cuff responses to these random questions that are going to come your way.
Okay.
So if you could have any superpower for your theological work, what would it be?
A superpower for my theological work would be the ability to write phrases so that people actually were awakened by the words on the page to feel as though they could hear the voice of Jesus in that room, and they can sense the nuances, the surround sound of the Spirit just permeating it into their being, and that in it all they would feel this heartbeat of the Father as a heartbeat of love, and that just as they would read the words, that the way that I'd write them would give that experience of living in that, in all of its unfolding nuances, just like watching a sunset, that it just keeps getting more and more beautiful, that's what people would receive through my writing.
Wow. What a response. I was just thinking make more money from, anyway, that's fantastic. So what's your biggest pet peeve in theological discussion?
My biggest pet peeve is that most people still think in terms of theology as argument, rationality, reasoning. Somebody needs to win. There's a way that we have to say this to be right. It's all that constrained, wearing a corset and not letting the fullness of our bodily being live and dance, kind of. So much of what I read is like, I couldn't give this to any of my students because it's just too, and for lack of a better word, boring.
Yeah.
It doesn't breathe the life. So it's that theology is still written too much for the head and not enough. I say, we have head, heart, and hand. We talk about as the three primary ways of learning and acting. Head, intelligence; heart, emotion; hand, activities in a sense are behavioral. So the fourth H is the hug. Theological writing does not live from the hug, and that requires another that sees the other and communicates to the other the value and the delight of living in that embrace. When theology misses that, I think it's just missing being theology.
Oh, that's lovely. Now, given the musical metaphors in your book, what are your favorite instruments? And do you play any? If so, what? Oh, he's reaching for something.
So first of all, I have to say I'm a vocal person. So the nature of vocal words, my wife's primarily a musician. She played the saxophone, but she can't sing very well with the saxophone in your mouth. So singing does definitely communicate. This is a little thing that I got about 20 years ago. It's called a puny tune.
Our listeners won't see this, but you're holding something that looks like a sawn-off recorder, I'd say.
And that's fine, yeah, with 4 holes in it. And I wore this around my neck in my early years of teaching theology, and said, the nature of this instrument, it has a body, it has structure, just like Jesus does. It requires that one allow wind to blow through it, just like the Spirit does, to be able to bring all that the beauty of what could be there. But also behind that, you need melodies and tunes. And that is the Father's covenanting love, is the melody that is blown through by the Spirit, the body of Christ, that brings us into, invitationally, a participation in the joy that requires all of those to be working at once. So my puny tune I've always loved is a Trinitarian metaphor of music that brings all this together and makes the room alive.
Lovely. Well, okay. Now thank you for that. This is all, that was almost scripted, that's suspicious. You've been seeing my notes. We've only got 15 minutes left, and there's so much to talk about in this volume. Where shall we go? Why don't we talk a little bit about the doctrine of election? Because this is a key area and may surprise some folk. Why is Barth talking about the doctrine of election and the doctrine of God? And so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how, in a nutshell, how Barth redefines traditional understandings of election, and how you might respond to criticisms of Barth's view. Maybe that's enough to be going on with. Yeah, maybe you can speak into that.
Yeah, and just to say, I think particularly you would appreciate, Chris, is to say that most people have electile dysfunction.
That's a good one. All right, I'm going to note that one down for future use.
And so they just don't, they are not aroused by the nature of what election's supposed to do.
Oh dear, he's running with it.
And election is supposed to arouse us to recognize the profundity of the love of God, who adores, acts, comes to us, does all that is necessary to delight us. So Barth wants it to really be a profound unveiling of the love of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And what do? We take passages like the opening of Ephesians and such, and we see that somebody's chosen. Oh, is it me? Am I chosen? And we make it all about us. We make it specific. We make it questionable for us. And the history of Calvinism has made it difficult. Arminian insights on the nature of, you may be chosen, but what you'll see on the other side, but you better be good. So there's a focus on human performance that easily slips in to make sure you're qualified to be one of the elect. So to say the nature of, from God's side, election isn't just about a moment when you pass from earth into eternity, whether or not you're one of those that gets to do it. Election is the everyday event of Jesus being the one who is for us and with us, and that he was chosen to be that from before the foundation of the world. Does it deal with our sin? Yes, every single day. It says, I see you, I know you, I recognize that. I am here to say yes to everything that is a correspondence that brings resonance in your life, so that you being conformed to my life is just, you've learned to hear the sound that I bring in my electing way of being. And as Jeremy Bigby says, jazz is that when there's somebody who begins the playing of something and that everyone doesn't play the same thing, they play something that is resonant with it in their own particular instrument. And so our election, or living with the election, is that Jesus is always the one who shows up as the lead and always invites us to bring the best of who we are, listening to him and listening to all the other musicians, so that something amazing is created. So election also can't just be about Jesus and his choice. It's Jesus and his choice for us to make a way of being with him, so that it always has this dimension of forness and withness, and that him being human means he really understands. It's not just a God who knows how everything could be in eternity and wishes we could live up to our possibility. No, election is the actuality of God, actually coming in time, actually becoming the light who comes in the world, who exposes the darkness where we get off tune, out of tune, where we live in a way that is dissonant and causes our ears to hurt. And so that the nature of salvation, again, is not just at the moment when we said we're a Christian or something like that. It is, as Barth himself inclined to say, it is something that comes from the heart of the Father in eternity. Election is the Father for us in eternity, and salvation is from eternity. Election and salvation is Jesus on the cross saying, "For you I hang here to say no to all that separates us, taking away the decree against you so that all will be yes and yes and yes. And I am elected and saved as the Spirit awakens me every day to live within the election salvation, to know that for this day, for this moment, for this success, for this failure, to recognize that the election of God is the unconditional, absolute commitment to be for us at all times and all places. All of Ephesians 1 is in him, by him, for him, but we live within it as the ones who are elected. And not only that, he elected to be the one who is damned on our side as well. He takes all of our failure, and that's what he takes to the cross. He says, yes, I will say no, but I will take the consequences of that no to the cross. And so in the end, election says, let God be true and every man a liar. But you know what? I am going to even remove the lie. Nothing can separate us. I've elected you. Nothing can separate us. You are all under sin. Yep. But you're also all under mercy, because all of you I have recognized. You all fail, but I will not let your failure, I will never let your no be anything near my yes. My Spirit will be the wind that breathes life into the deadness of your bodies, because election always takes that which is dead and makes it alive.
Yeah.
From creation, through the cross, through resurrection, through ascension, to Pentecost, the election of God is present in all of that as God's act in choosing to be the alive maker.
Yeah.
Who will always do that in every aspect of our lives.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, we're going to have to skip over a lot here. We don't have time to look at God's being and perfections and epistemology and just how robust the ethical language is in this volume. The Christology and its centrality. There's so much that we could talk upon, but I did want to come to one area, I think, which is an area where Barth is very often misunderstood. And that is about the nature of human response. Because your book rightly emphasizes human response to God's revelation. And you've touched on this, actually, already in quite a lot of what you've been saying. But many of us might think of human response as something that Barth eclipses, that Barth isn't so concerned about, that he's more interested in talking about what God does, to the extent that it deletes our human responsiveness. And so I've seen, certainly in the world of Pauline scholarship, more Barthian friends of mine who are also Pauline scholars will be critiqued as if they are deleting responsiveness and human agency because of the way in which they're speaking of Jesus. And Barth, of course, has been criticized for the same. And you are crystal clear in the book about what's actually going on here. So maybe you could just give us a brief a glimpse into your work there.
Yeah. Well, response implies that there was something that was said first, right? And so in the Doctrine of God, Volume 2, Barth is really giving us the what is said first, so that we'll know what response looks like. And so if the nature of what God says is a profound unpacking of the nature of his love for us, there's this sense that when the other expresses love for us, then falling in love is our response to the other who is there. And so if you don't acknowledge the one who we fall in love with, then it's just you having a bunch of feelings and choices. And I think of Ann Wilson Schaef's book, Escape from Intimacy. We come up with all kinds of things that we call intimacy, sex, relationship. These things we just perform them and think that we're in a real intimate place when it's actually just us wanting to have a relationship or to have romance. But it isn't really with the other. Barth's ethic says, until the other shows up and we sense the profundity of the love of that one for us, we're not going to be able to respond in a way that's truly an ethical response to God. It's just going to be you trying to get God to like you because you didn't hear him in the first place. So that's acknowledging, again, the natural theology piece that we think that God would love us more if we did this. That's what most ethics does. If I'm good, then God will love me. I'll send my kids to Sunday school so they'll be good so God will love them. No, the nature of Barth's bold statement here is that the only way you'll become ethical is if the reality of the God who loves you actually shows up, you hear it, and it penetrates your soul. The song to know him is to love him. Do you know that song?
Oh, I do not know.
Well, it's a song probably in the 50s or the 60s. We have it as a human, maybe a spouse singing to another. But if God says to know my children is to love them, and I do, yes I do, why can't they see? How blind can they be? Someday they will see that they were meant for me. Oh, yes. So if you just get that that's what God is doing, and Barth's wanting to unpack that in this final section of Volume 2, is that God's revelation isn't just so you'll know that he's the creator, sustainer, maintainer of the universe, and that the Trinity is three persons, and all of those things are true. But if the dynamic of the address is not heard, you will only always ever respond to your own intuitions about what God might or must want. It comes as a must in our head, and you won't actually hear. And it's like the person who marries somebody just thinking how wonderful it'll be to have their needs met, and they never ask the question, what about this other?
Yeah.
Right? And so if you don't learn to mutually hear the value that you bring to each other and the covenant or agreements of life to be for and with each other, then you will default to something that will serve one and not the other, and the relationship will ultimately fracture and fall apart.
Yeah.
God comes and makes sure that we got the part that we respond to down quite clearly, so that when in the future volumes we respond to God, we know who we're responding to and what it is that he said and will be to us. His command is love me, love one another, love yourself.
Yeah.
Get used to it.
I think what you're getting at here in this part of the Church Dogmatics is going to be really surprising for those who are only acquainted with Barth secondhand, as it were. I remember reading a part of Church Dogmatics, I think it was volume 2, many years ago, before I really understood what was going on and understanding how this language was Christologically augmented. But Barth said something along the lines of, the revelation of God is not God alone, but God and man together.
Uh-huh.
And this came as a huge surprise, because this isn't some kind of revelational triumphalism. And I think you're articulating beautifully why there are surprises for many readers as they work through your pages. Now, I realize we are running out of time here, and I've got a couple of questions. I'll start with a flippant one, because I'm flippant and I can't help it. But you have a section with multiple authors making interdisciplinary connections. So, apart from the essays by David Guretzky, Earl Palmer, Wyatt Hoots, Andrew Howie, James Houston, Ross Tatings, and Jeremy Begbie. So apart from all of them, which was your favorite essay?
Well, that is just so crystal clear for me, Chris. There's no one else that qualifies as an answer to that question other than you. You light up the sky.
Well, there's a surprise.
Make it all shine and glitter and beauty.
So, scattered throughout, you've got these, I think it's 21. I think it is anyway. 21 insights for pastors. What was your favorite to write?
They're all interesting because I'm really trying to get in and say, okay, Pastor, I know you need to fill your pews. You need to have people congratulate you at the door. I know that's what your inclination is going to be. And I just want to figure out how every time people will walk out and say, were you the one speaking today? I think it might have been you, but I really heard God speak. And so as I write these insights for pastors, I'm really wanting to say, how is Barth wanting a pastor to preach in such a way that you almost get past cute insights, stories that distract from? They may add to the hearing of it. I mean, I love bringing in stories that add to living in the space of relationship. But I think that the nature of Barth's insistence on being the God who loves in freedom, if we could just have pastors really get that the God who loves in freedom is going to be the only proper motivation. It's not going to be, you need a better marriage, you need a better, anything, that to really just permeate the depth of a person, that from the pulpit, hearing the voice that knows that God is elected to be for them and with them, and that's going to be the distinguishing feature of an abundance of life before them. And that's what I'm trying to resonate with in each one of these insights for pastors. And the moment where there's kind of like a butterfly, or a moth becoming it's a worm becoming a butterfly. That's what I'm hoping the pastoral insight will bring, that there's a clarity and a color that comes, and that humans will feel like they're almost awakening for the first time to what it means to be pastors, and to see people getting it and to go, wow, when the love of Christ permeates these people, they start coming back and telling me stories about hearing Jesus, choosing to be with them and for them. They gave them eyes and ears to hear a neighbor or somebody they met in the store, and just the nature of the love that flows when the God who lives in freedom, who elects to be with them, who accompanies them, who shows up with them to create an ethical response, has these everyday stories of beauty, embrace, service, kindness, restoration. When I see what I invite pastors into doing that, I get very excited.
Yeah, indeed. Now, we've run out of time, so maybe you could just tell us a bit about the future projects on your plate, when we can expect the next volumes, and if you've got anything else in the pipeline.
I do. So Church Dogmatics 3 should be out in June of 2025. So that's just a year away. That is, I'm done with it basically, except for on next Wednesday, I'll be doing a little final editing, I think, that from things back from the publisher. Volume 4 there are traditionally, we would say there's 4.1, 4.2, 4.3.1, 4.3.2, and then 4.4. But I'm also doing the Christian life, and I'm also adding a section that Barth would have, I think, added on the Lord's Supper using Paul Molnar's work. And there also was a journal essay that he wrote on that as well. So I'll try and include more on the ethics of the Doctrine of Reconciliation of that. So I'm 6 volumes. I'm in volume 4.2, which is the second of the really big ones in the beginning. And that should be out June of 2027. I've also begun, as I go along, particularly in 4, working on CD 5, the Doctrine of Redemption. And so that is to be out 2028. So I'm working on the basic overarching structure of it. I have the major chapters within what would have been the Dogmatics. I think there would have been 3 volumes. So, I've got that outlined, and every day, basically, I'm copying and pasting things that Barth is saying as I go along that apply to things that would be there, with little notes on what it is that he's pointing towards that I will just continue to play out. Some other things that I'm working on. I have a 5-volume series on the Psalms called The Listening Point, The Art of Bringing the Psalms to Life. So the first volume of that is written. Getting a publisher to do 5 volumes, it's not that they don't like the content. They say, 5 volumes is too much and all this. Anyway, I'm still praying for a publisher on that. I have another work that I'm working on called The Embrace, and it's using our body to think and pray theologically. So there are different movements of the Father, the Son, Spirit, both listening movements as well as responsive movements, and then the interplay of each of those going to the depth of the interplay of each of the persons of the Trinity on those. So to get theology is an embodied way where we can be praying and thinking and hearing the voice of the Father, Son, and the Spirit is something I'm very interested in. In the spring, I will be going to the University of Oklahoma on a fellowship and working on a book called The Science of the Personal, which is based both on Torrance's work as well as Barth's work, of just saying science traditionally deals the world of the impersonal, of objects. It's merely a choice not to study the world of the personal, but that's what Barth and Torrance do. What would it look like to have a serious science of the personal? So I am working on that as well. And then also in educational theory, there are three domains of learning. That, again, it's the head, heart, hand type thing. And so the fourth domain of learning, the relational, to say most of the learning we do in life is learned in relationship, but it has not been acknowledged that that's where our learning happens. It would be great for the church, but also for just education in general, to recognize the relational is a domain of learning that we need to begin to articulate and explore, and to see all the things that need to happen there and that don't happen in a world of individualism where the relationship is basically set aside. So it is a profoundly theologically rooted, but profoundly practical for asking what is education and what are its goals for restoring humanity.
Yeah, your mind is on fire, clearly, with a lot of ideas. That's fantastic.
These are just a few of the 40 books that I have in my file, books to write, that I have outlines at least, and some more than that.
Well, may God give you all that you need to accomplish this monumental task, is all I can say. It has been a joy.
May he do that, yes.
A joy having you back on OnScript. It really has been. And I never know how to end these podcasts, you know? Never know. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the podcast. And I suppose now is where I sign off and say something like, until the next time. But it always feels a bit wet. Have you got anything else that we should say, Marty? How do we sign off?
How do we sign off? I always like to live in the hearing of the voice. The voice of the Father says, "You are my beloved child." The Son says, "I am with you and for you always." And the Spirit says, "I am here to empower you for a life of love." If you could take that away from what we've talked about here and just live with that voice in your head, you will be properly attuned to what it is that God wants to be with you and for you today. And I think take away what you need to from here.
And on that note, we finish.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.